I talk a lot about land conservation. I talk about how a particular piece of land was saved for future generations to enjoy. I talk about how a piece of land came to have such spectacular natural features, or I talk about how a piece of land came to play a part in our broader cultural history. I'm a conservationist, and I care deeply about preserving land so that we and those who come after us can come to enjoy the spectacular scenery our public lands have to offer. In the United States, national parks are one of the premier ways we do this, so much so that I've dedicated an entire channel to telling their stories. But today, I'm not telling you the story of a park and the piece of land it protects. I'm telling you the story of a park and the culture and the art form and the music it protects. Today, I'm telling you the story of the New Orleans Jazz National Historical Park. Alright, I'm out here on my first day in New Orleans in the Crescent City, and I'm excited to dive into jazz in this city. The history, the culture, how it became so synonymous with this city, and ultimately how that led to the creation of a national park for jazz. So for my first stop, I'm heading to the New Orleans Jazz National Historical Park Visitor Center on Peters Street. Now, the park doesn't actually have that big of a physical presence here in the city. There's only like 3 locations actually associated with it. But then again, it doesn't really need to. It's different from other parks in that way. It doesn't preserve a specific building or a specific location, but rather a type of music, jazz. Now, this park was established in 1994 to preserve and interpret all things jazz. It does this through various programming and partnerships throughout the city, all designed to preserve and interpret the history and culture of jazz, get people to appreciate the music, and just understand its importance to New Orleans. But jazz, of course, long predates the establishment of this park, and there's a reason it developed specifically in New Orleans. I mean, think of all the peoples and cultures that have come through New Orleans since it was settled. It was founded by the French, and then the Spanish took it over, and then the French took it back over, and then they sold it to the United States. The French and Spanish already had their cultures established here, including a heavy Caribbean influence, which put an emphasis on singing and dancing and celebration. And then the United States comes in and puts its own culture right down on top of that. Also, New Orleans was a big port of entry for the slave trade, so there came to be a large African American population here as well. After the Civil War, it was newly freed African Americans who perhaps contributed most substantially to the development of jazz in the form of blues music, which aimed to express the hardships of sharecropping and the discrimination they faced in a Jim Crow South. But then blues music interacted with all those other cultures which had brought their own musical styles to New Orleans, and they kind of just all blended together. Ragtime, blues, spirituals, gospel. There were these brass marching bands which have a long tradition in New Orleans, European classical music. All of it just kind of coalesces to form jazz. Now, the origins of jazz are like super complicated, and I can't possibly cover it all here. If you're interested in learning more, I highly recommend the Ken Burns documentary just called Jazz. But what I think is important to remember here is that jazz couldn't have developed anywhere else in the United States, or maybe even the world. Nowhere else had that unique medley of cultures and peoples and attitudes and musical styles that, when thrown into the melting pot that is New Orleans, ultimately became jazz. I'm on my way to my next destination, the New Orleans Jazz Museum. The Park Service has a relationship here. It's one of those partnerships I was telling you about. And every Tuesday at 2 p.m., they put on a performance, which I'm really excited about because it's going to be my first live jazz performance here in New Orleans. Alright, I'm here at the Jazz Museum and I'm just about to go inside and listen to some jazz. But let me tell you about this performance first. So I'm going to see the Arrowhead Jazz Band, which is the in-house band for the New Orleans Jazz National Historical Park. That's right, these are music rangers. They play jazz and they jam and they work for the National Park Service. That's so cool. What better way for the Park Service to interpret jazz than to play you jazz from their actual jazz band? And you know, the name Arrowhead comes from the National Park Service logo, which is an arrowhead, in case you didn't know. It's pretty clever. Anyway, let's check it out.
Alright, can you snap your fingers just like this? Yeah!
Okay, as I'm editing this, I'm not sure how much of each of these I can show you because they were doing songs from like actual artists and I don't want to get into any copyright trouble. So what I'm going to do is just like play you a couple of clips from all of their performances just so you can get a feel of like what they do there. They're really talented. It was super awesome. Just sit back, enjoy the vibes that they were putting off. It's just a really cool performance and I want you guys to see it.
Yeah!
Right, that was really cool. They have an awesome space in there. They had some guest performers with them as well. And I think it's just really cool that the Park Service has that sort of presence here, right? So not only are they bringing jazz to the community for free, I might add, at the New Orleans Jazz Museum, but they have performers from the community. So not all of them were in the Arrowhead Jazz Band. And just seeing that sort of performance, that sort of partnership they have, and the relationship they have with the city and their commitment to bringing jazz to people out here in New Orleans, both visitors and locals alike, I think it's really cool, and I think it's right in line with the mission of this New Orleans Jazz National Historical Park. And I'm starting to get a better understanding of jazz here in the city. Alright, I'm out here on day 2 in my journey to understand New Orleans jazz culture and the New Orleans Jazz National Historical Park. So I'm heading to another location the Park Service has a relationship with, and it's named after someone you might have heard of. His name is Louis Armstrong. Louis Armstrong comes from a period of jazz history when it was widespread, when it was mainstream. After the development of jazz around the turn of the 20th century, thanks to that New Orleans cultural medley we talked about, it goes on to become the most popular form of music in America. Like, the 1920s are literally called the Jazz Age, and musicians like Louis Armstrong bring jazz to people all across America and even the world. Places like New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles become big jazz cities. And new technologies like the phonograph mean people can listen to jazz right in their homes. It was big, it was loud, it was energetic, it was jazz. But it never lost its New Orleans roots. I mean, there's a reason there's a national park here and nowhere else. New Orleans is the home of jazz. All right, it's at this point that I think I probably need to admit something to you. This park has been throwing me for a loop, and it's made producing this video a little bit challenging. I won't lie. Normally, having the structure of different locations kind of defines how I visit a park, which this one doesn't have. See, there's two things I'm not good at. Well, I mean, there's more than two things, but for this video in particular, two things have stood out. The two things I'm not good at are feelings and spontaneity. When I make these videos, especially on the road, I like to have everything all planned out. I like to know exactly what I'm going to say and where I'm going to say it. They're meticulously planned and researched because I want to give you all the best possible park videos that I can. But when I was at home, sitting there researching jazz, there was something I just wasn't getting. And I realized I was never going to get it by sitting at home and planning out my every move. If there's one thing I've learned about jazz, it's about feeling and spontaneity. Those two things I'm not good at. But it's those two things I'm going to need to finish this video because I don't have a plan from here. My script literally says, figure it out. So if jazz is about feeling and spontaneity and creativity and improvisation, that's what I'm going to use to immerse myself in the jazz culture here in New Orleans, and hopefully show you the value of having a national park tied to a feeling and an idea rather than a physical location. All right, let's see what we can find. All right, I think I'm gonna have it a Frenchman Street because a lot of you guys recommended that when I asked for places to go watch live jazz. Alright, so I ended up at Bambula's for that one. They had the doors open and the music was filtering out, and it was very inviting and very chill. And that's kind of why I wanted to let this video go a little more freeform at this point, just to let the creativity and spontaneity and improvisation of jazz take me where it will. And yeah, so I ended up at Bambula's, had a great time. She said they were playing like swing music, swing style music. Most of the things I think they were playing were written in the 1940s. She could have said anything and I would have believed her because, again, I know nothing about jazz, but it was a really great time. I'm glad I stopped in, and we'll see where else we go. All right, so that was the Spotted Cat. Again, the music was just filtering out onto the sidewalk and inviting me in. So I walked in, and this band was playing like a different style of music. It was much more up-tempo, upbeat, more energetic, more charismatic. They had more members in there. They had a guest performer as well. And the crowd was really into it. Like once they got going, once they got really upbeat, there was people just filtering in the whole time. And they were really grooving, really getting into it. It was just very energetic. It was awesome. And this is, again, what I wanted to do today. Just see where the music takes me, find this energy and this charisma and this improvisational creative musical style here in New Orleans that relates to jazz. That ultimately is what led to the creation of a national park here for jazz. It's just been a really cool experience today, and I think I have one more stop tonight. There's a free performance that I found out about from the bassist player uh, at the Arrowhead Jazz Band performance last night. So I think we're gonna head there tonight after dinner and just get a performance of jazz in the park, yet another venue here. So I'm excited to dive into that. Let's go check it out. It's my final day here in New Orleans, and I've had an absolute blast diving into the city's jazz culture. Now, I've seen a lot of jazz these past few days. I've seen jazz in clubs, in studios, on the street, and in parks. I've seen all different styles of jazz, although the nuances of those are lost on me, so I apologize to all of you jazz people. But what I want to do today is just go take a moment to reflect on what I've seen and what I've heard here and what I've experienced here. And so I'm going to take the oldest streetcar line in America, the St. Charles line, to a park. Are you surprised? So what I think has really struck me the most about jazz in New Orleans is simply how ingrained it is into the fabric of this city. Like, yes, New Orleans is famous for jazz, but what you really get a sense for when you're here is just how passionate people are about it. It kind of just filters through the cracks of everyday life, and it leads to this jazz-infused sense of energy and charisma. It's honestly one of my favorite things about the city. And I can see now that so much of that is not just because of jazz music itself, but the culture and outlook it breeds in the people who love it. Jazz moves you, or at least it moved me in ways I can't quite explain. For someone like me who is highly analytical and who likes to think my way through life with brute force, immersing myself in jazz in New Orleans has made me just stop and feel the rhythm of the music and the passion of the people playing it and the vibrancy of the city they were playing it in. It made me feel alive and connected to that very moment, just sitting there listening to jazz. And I think that's the real value of a place like the New Orleans Jazz National Historical Park. It would have been really easy for me to sit at home, do a bunch of research on jazz, recite some facts and figures and data for you, and then give you a nice tidy video on how the park operates. But that would have been doing a disservice to what this park is all about, to educate and immerse people in the history, the culture, and yes, the feeling of jazz in New Orleans. Doing a story on a park like this got me out of my comfort zone, and it forced me not just to think, but to feel. And it radically changed the way I think about what a park can be, that you don't always need a historic building or structure to properly preserve history, that sometimes you just need a feeling. And I hope I have conveyed that feeling to you, that feeling of spontaneity and creativity and energy that jazz just gives to New Orleans. If you've made it this far, thank you. I know this was a hard right turn from what I normally make on the channel, but it was important to me to tell the story of the New Orleans Jazz National Historical Park in a way that I felt did it justice. If you want to see other stories about parks that are like way different from this one, then please consider subscribing to the channel. I have a whole backlog of park stories on there that you can dive into right now. And if you would like to support me a little bit further, then I also have a Patreon. You can get like 3 extra videos a month on there, plus the one you're watching right now, early and ad-free, and I have a Discord. So head on over to patreon.com/National Park Diaries if you'd like to support what I'm doing further. Thank you genuinely so much for watching. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.